The sound that pulled me out of the rhythm of scissors and stems was not the phone or a bell. It was rain, hard, impatient rain pattering at the shop windows like a man with something urgent to say. I had my head down over a bucket of peonies, thumbs stained a stubborn pink, when the bell above the door announced a customer who looked like he'd been chased by the weather and lost on purpose. He was soaked through his jacket, hair plastered to his forehead, eyes the color of river stones. He smiled apologetically at the puddle he left behind and asked for the cheapest bouquet I had that still looked like someone cared. It was one of those ordinary nights that insists on being remembered. The shop smelled like cut green and soap and coffee gone cold in an enamel mug. I wrapped stems in brown paper without thinking, handed him the bouquet, and he fumbled, as if he had rehearsed how to be clumsy near strangers and failed beautifully. Then he asked if he could wait out the rain inside. That's how it began. No grand sweep of fate, just a man, a storm, and a chair by the work table where the light catches the dust like motes in a sunbeam. We talked about nothing, the kind of nothing that keeps you from being polite without making you vulnerable. The weather, the shop, the city sheathed in wet. He said his name was Nico, like it was a name you only heard on postcards or in filmsta. Clipped Italian consonants leaned into my ear like a secret. It shouldn't have mattered. He shouldn't have mattered. But later that week, in a space where powdered milk meets the rim of a mug, and decisions become smaller and clearer, I let him matter for one night. I am not a person who loses herself as I own Blumenthorn because accountability works for me. I pay my taxes on time because it clarifies commitments. I left my last serious relationship because routine taught me more than heartbreak ever did how to be my own life. The night Nico slid out of my shop and into the rain seemed like an anomaly I would stitch over with my usual neatness. But weeks are sly. They rearrange the map until the place you thought was your own has a new landmark. The ultrasound sat on my kitchen counter like a piece of contraband. I had carried it there wrapped in a paper towel, then kept it under the kettle, because where else do you keep things you're not sure you want to look at again? I left it wrapped for a day, and then a week. When I finally unwrapped it, there it was. A gray smudge and a heart that skipped when the technician said 7 weeks. When you are a woman who prunes roses for a living and marks your days by deliveries and inventory, 7 weeks sounds both impossibly brief and permanently altering. I told Sophie, my Sophie, who had been my sounding board since we were 20 and thought karaoke was the height of bravery. I told Marie, because Marie is the one who brings pastries and refuses to take no for an explanation. They fussed. They made faces. They gave me the practical questions like a pair of hand-me-down gloves. Are you sure of the dates? Have you thought about your job? Do you want it? I answered honestly. I was not sure, and I did not yet know what I wanted. Then the paper arrived. It was one of those mornings when the city smells like wet pavement and everything seems, for a moment, salvageable. Sophie had a habit of dropping by with a paper folded like a manifesto. She burst into the shop with the energy of someone who had consumed an entire season of a show and needed commentary. Open it, she said, tapping the newspaper like a gavel. She always used that impatient, conspiratorial tone when she wanted to be a conspirator rather than a friend. I unfolded the paper as slowly as a confession. The headline had more teeth than the weather. Volontiers to wed, controversial alliance. There was a Photoshop, suited, an angle that made him both dangerous and perfectly ordinary at the same time. There was a name under the photograph, Niki Cobarente. It was followed by a cascade of details I would have learned through rumors if not for the print. The Valente family. The peace marriage because they do things on a scale that requires alliances. The ultrasound felt heavy in my hands for reasons that had nothing to do with its size. I had carried it around in the quiet as if it were something fragile of my own making. Now it lay between my thumb and forefinger and looked absurd, paper and grain and possibility. The idea of someone wearing a tux that would be photographed for tomorrow's paper and then sitting at a table with parents who negotiated marriages like contracts made my throat go cold. I did what I would do when a stem is rotting at the base of an arrangement. I cut it out. I tore it. It was precise in its violence. I folded the ultrasound into thirds with the efficiency of someone used to the economy of doing things alone, then ripped. The edges were jagged and white against the brown of the paper towel. I watched the pieces flutter like confetti, ridiculous and small. Sophie gasped. Marie said my name like she was deciding which charity to call first. I told them I'd be fine, because panic is more acceptable in private than in public. The hand that ripped was not trembling. The hand that wound the paper into a ball and dropped it in the trash had been making choices since she was old enough to sweep her own bedroom, and yet, watching the pieces fall felt like an admission that my life was no longer mine to predict. It was a surrender and a reclaiming all at once. Later, when I cleared the counter, there was a tiny triangle of glossy print caught beneath the pot of lavender, a fragment with a curve of image I couldn't place. I brushed it away like it was a petal from a flower I hadn't meant to ruin. If this story is the kind of slow-burn high-stakes romance you stay up for, subscribe, Sophie said, half joking, half sincere, because she believes in playlists and in hope like it's a practical thing. We laughed, briefly, like people who use humor to stop the world from tipping. I should have folded the moment into my routine and moved on. I should have told myself that some mistakes are one-night errors and that life has a crisper margin than headlines. When Nico walked back into Blumenthorn the following Tuesday, he was holding a bouquet of my own making. He looked like he had rehearsed the apology he had not yet given and practiced the posture of a man who expected his name to divide rooms. He recognized me, immediately, not the woman in the photograph, but the woman with sap under her nails and calluses earned by closing time. He asked for the bouquet he'd left the week before, as if the world had folded and returned something to the place it belonged. He leaned over the counter. His hand brushed mine as he pointed to the wedding announcement in the paper Sophie had left for me. His eyes didn't ask. They catalogued. He picked up the crumpled napkin, where I'd thrown the ultrasound scraps after I'd cleaned the counter. I should have told him to leave. Instead, I watched, because people who come into your shop and know how you wrap stems end up knowing more than you intend. He smoothed the napkin on the counter, then fished out the small, jagged pieces. His fingers moved with a kind of brute tenderness as he fit the bits back together, like assembling a puzzle you know will reveal something you may not want to see. When the image folded into a semblance of meaning, he did not look triumphal. He looked like a man discovering evidence and deciding, in a single breath, what to do with it. I wasn't supposed to be in the photo, he said. The sentence was simple. It did not come with apologies or explanations, only the raw fact of it. But I was there. That night, he canceled a wedding. I didn't know that was possible. A man taking a printed arrangement of plans and setting them on fire with the same right he reserved for his espresso. He announced, to everyone with a phone and ears, that the wedding would not proceed. He told them, Mendewald, that the child was his. The words were not a paternity test. They were a claim. They were a public staking of interest in a thing that would change everything. The Valenti name carried with it a kind of gravitational pull. When Nico said something, it tended to bend the space around it. There was an image of him on television that night, a silhouette against flashbulb light, and the caption below made my chest tighten, because now the shards of the ultrasound belonged, in some shape, to an entire city's imagination. They belonged to people who made alliances, the way I made centerpieces careful, for presentation. They belonged to families that thought, in generations, and incidents like mine were often footnotes in a ledger. I felt both exposed and curiously naked in relief. A part of me, scarred by years of doing things alone, whispered that claiming could also be a shield. But nobody gets to claim another person like a found object. That was the difference. My choices, however, messy, had always been my own, and the idea of being spoken for in public without my consent sat like a foreign object in my throat. When Nico's announcement made the rounds, my shop became a rumor mill. Crowds of regulars strolled in with a different air, some eyes curious, some hungry for scandal. I found myself explaining less and smiling more. It was a new job I had not applied for. Antonio Valenti arrived 2 days later. I remember him as a man who occupied space as one might expect a patriarch to, quietly, and with a geometry that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He walked into Blumenthorn the way winter walks into a house, sober and deliberate. He wore the same expression he gave to matters where patience was a currency and time a tool. He did not raise his voice. He asked questions the way someone asks whether a book is worth reading. "Why is my son in the papers?" he asked. It was not a question about the wedding. It was a question about the ripple. I told him what I had told Sophie and Marie. The man had come in during a storm. We had shared a night. I had done what I thought would keep things simple. I left out the tender details and kept the facts. I told him, bluntly, that I had torn up the ultrasound. He did not react with anger. He reacted with a calculation that reminded me of pruning. If something unhealthy is left to the branch long enough, it will take the rest with it. He offered, to my face, and in the way only the very wealthy offer things, protection, and a temporary place for me to stay. He did not make it sound like a negotiation. He stated it like a fact, the same way you might state that noon follows morning. No, I said. I said it because autonomy is a muscle I exercise daily. I won't be moved. He regarded me, and for a moment we both tested the edges of each other's resolve. Then he softened, not in surrender, but in strategy. Temporary, he said. Until the noise fades. Until you are safe. It was the kind of sentence that sounded reasonable and locked a door I hadn't known existed. It sounded like safety, but also like a perimeter. I could imagine the guest suite. He meant the one with thick curtains and staff who took instructions like scripture. I could imagine my plants trimmed into shapes I would not have chosen. I could imagine not making the coffee in my chipped mug. I agreed on terms. I would not be paraded. I would keep the keys to my shop and come and go as I pleased. There would be no press at the door. He smiled a tiny, rueful smile and passed me his card with an economy of motion that said he was used to meetings concluding with signatures. Sophie protested like someone who was seeing a friend being drafted into service under a false name. You're not a hostage, she said, which is, of course, something only an outsider can safely assert. I'm not a refugee, I told her. This is temporary, like stitches. I said it with a confidence I did not entirely feel. Moving into the Valente guest house felt like stepping into an alternate life I had once seen in other people's photographs. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and furniture that had been designed to resist usage. They had a view of the courtyard where statues watched like good-natured judges. My suitcase looked ridiculous against the lacquered floors. My hands missed the grit of the soil in the pots back at Bloom and Thorn. Nico's presence was complicated. He would arrive without fanfare and bring with him the authority of a man used to commanding rooms. He was not loud. He was not theatrical. He was present, like a hinge. He came at odd hours when I would be making tea, when the moonlight caught the edge of a photograph on the mantel. He cleaned in a way that was less about domesticity and more about restoring order. Once, in the guest suite's kitchen, I found him at the sink, sleeves rolled, soap suds up to his wrist. He didn't announce himself. He didn't act as though he was rescuing me. He simply did the dishes. You're not a trophy, he said once, when I accused his family of speaking for me. His voice was the sort that didn't ask permission to be blunt. You're a person. He had a way of limiting himself to the essential truth so that everything else could be chosen by me. For someone born into a world where decisions were often made on behalf of others to avoid complications, that was a radical kindness. There were boundaries we agreed to, as if we were commissioning a painting together. I would not be monitored by cameras. I would have my own savings, and my access to Bloom and Thorn would be unimpeded. He would refrain from media statements. He kept his word about most of it. He did not keep his word about the world being quiet. A small dent arrived in the form of a black SUV parked too long outside my shop. A man who did not make noise but whose presence had the efficiency of an insult. A window was cracked in the night, nothing more than a hairline fracture, and a note left on the counter that read, I know where you put the basil. These were not cinematic threats, no masked men breaking down walls, no dramatic showdowns filmed in. They were the quieter, more effective intimations of someone letting you know they could reach you. They were the fingerprints of a world that understood leverage. When I brought these things to Nika, he did not scoff. He made a phone call. A few measured words that felt like a parry to a strike I hadn't known to fear until I heard his voice make it vanish from the air. Then he came to the shop. He did not come like a conqueror. He came with a box of pastries from a bakery I had praised once and a pair of gardening gloves. He stayed for an hour and learned the rhythm of my hands as I trimmed a stem. He asked if I wanted more lights in the back room. He told me he had spoken to his father and his father had instructed that the shop remain untouched. The shop remained mine to hold. I watched him move among the flowers, like a man in a foreign tongue learning to speak. He was clumsy with the delicate things at first, then less so, until I stopped noticing how his hands hovered near mine and only saw how his shoulders would relax when he stacked a box or swept the floor. He was present, not imposing. He practiced the difference. There were nights when I would wake to the sound of his voice in the hallway, and when I opened the door there he would be reading a book by the doorway light. Once, he brought Mateo a small wooden toy he had chosen because the shape reminded him of something he had loved as a child. He asked permission before leaving it on the shelf in my kitchen. Permission was a word I hadn't expected him to respect with such It would have been easy for me to let gratitude dissolve into dependence. Gratitude is a quicksilver that makes prisons out of good intentions. I resisted that. I reminded him often and bluntly that protection without agency is a shifting veneer. He listened, some of it learned rather than innate. He apologized when he overstepped, and he tried again. These were the things that made me lower my walls a millimeter at a time. The Valente family did not accept me quietly. There were meetings deflected away from me. The kind of territorial adjustments that happen when a man introduces a new element into a family equation. Gabriella, Nico's sister, became my ally in small ways. She brought Luca, her son, to the shop and let him eat sprigs of rosemary like misbehaving confetti. She asked about my suppliers and learned which soil I preferred. She treated me as if I might be a useful addition rather than an inconvenient variable. One night, a week after the window, a man from the Russo side came to the perimeter of town, though not to the door. Not to my Durand, someone left a bag of nails outside Bloom and Thorn. It was the kind of thing that made my spine go thin. The nail bag felt like a punctuation mark at the end of an argument that had not yet been spoken. It made it clear that this was no longer merely between a man who had come in from the rain and a woman who owned a shop. It was a negotiation that would require the careful handling of more than flowers. "You're choosing a dangerous dance," Serena Antonio told me in one of the long conversations that take place when two people are learning to measure each other's boundaries. He spoke as if he were teaching me to prune a rosebush correctly. His tone was patient, exact. But choice is choice. I wanted to tell him that I knew that. I wanted to tell him I had not chosen the scrape, but I had chosen the consequences I would live with. But those words are thinner when said to a man who can move cities at the flick of a remark. Instead, I said the practical things. I said I wanted legal counsel consulted, that I would not participate in any staged press, and that I would keep my shop open. He frowned like an accountant, surprised by an unbalanced ledger. "Good," he said. "We will arrange so you are safe." Safety, again, was a thing offered like a glove you put on when it suits you. I accepted the glove with the same pragmatism that makes me buy insurance. I signed papers I did not read in full because lawyers will always explain contracts in a way that makes them palatable. The point was not the content, but the compact. I would not be displayed. I would keep my autonomy, but I would reside temporarily on the property. Protection would be discreet. Nico would not speak to the press. For a while, the world obliged. The SUV left, the nails disappeared. The hairline in the window repaired itself. The shop steadied as if nothing had happened, which was the most dangerous kind of peace, the one that invites complacency. Then a photograph of Nico, with the hand of a woman who was not me, appeared on a gossip site, contradiction as choreography. It was a picture of him at a ribbon cutting, smiling with someone in a dress I had never seen. Comments threaded like spiders. Conspiracy theories? Anger. And the inevitable gossip that attaches itself to names like ticks, to fur. I spent a morning cleaning condensation from the inside of the glass and watching as customers found my face in the news and tried to reconcile. The version of me they liked with the headline they liked more. I am a woman who prefers the tactile solutions to complicated problems. I pulled the peonies because their stems were straight and patient. I arranged them so that their heads leaned toward the light. Order in petals feels like a small insistence that life can be coaxed into pleasing shapes. But the outside world kept intruding in small, corrosive ways that eroded the edges of that insistence. One evening, after a day of customers who wanted to know whether I was all right and whether I would press charges, Nico came to the shop carrying a small box. He closed the door softly behind him. I could see the way his jaw set when he watched me move. It was like watching someone consider how best to rebuild a fragile structure without flattening the thing that made it whole. He had found the scraps of the ultrasound. He had reassembled them in his own way and set them on the counter like a question that could be answered only by someone willing to take the risk of saying yes. I looked at the assembled photo, the grainy curve, the suggestion of a beginning end. For the first time I allowed myself to think of the possible shape of that life, not as a problem, but as an insistence. It doesn't make you less, he said quietly, as if he were naming the color of a wall. It makes us more complicated. Complication is a polite word for upheaval. It also felt, weirdly, like honesty. I cupped my thumbnail against the glossy corner of the photograph and felt the small tremor of something like fear, like hope. He left soon after, and I folded the image into my wallet like a talisman I did not yet believe in. There were nights in the guest house when I would fall asleep and wake to the echo of someone who had once been a stranger, stirring tea in the next room. There were mornings when I would find him on the couch with a book, pages marked with pressed leaves, as if he had a private collection of small things he wanted to save from the world. There were arguments, sharp conversations about boundaries, and the way a man with a name like Valente moves through a room as if the curtains were his signature. He learned to ask, to seek consent, to remind me that protection and possession are not the same. But the world does not respect learning as much as it respects outcomes. The Russo men do not stop sending messages just because a man learns to ask questions. People who have been cut out of advantage do not simply decide to be civil because the heirs have chosen to change. Violence, when it exists under another's authority, tends to look for the lowest cost way back into the ledger. One night, not long after the photograph resurfaced online and after I had begun to accept the strange domesticity of a man who does dishes and reads late into the night, the shop alarm went off. It was the kind of shrill sound that wakes your body before your mind understands the meaning. I had been asleep upstairs in the guest suite. Nico found me with my hair in a loose knot and my slippers on, eyes wide, heart an uneven rhythm. He moved with the efficiency of someone who has been trained in crisis management. He shrugged a jacket on, wrapped an arm around me like a promise, and took my hand as if I were both fragile and obstinately whole. Outside, in the rain that never seemed to stop these months, a line of men stood beyond the circle of light. They did not break the door. They left a bag of stones on the step instead of entering. The message was there. We can find you. We can bruise what you love without blood on our hands. That morning, as the light found its way through the shop windows, I watched Nico speak in low tones that cut the air like garden shears. He paced and spoke and then stopped and listened. He treated the problem not as an excuse to roar, but as a thing to resolve. When he turned to me, his face was no longer the photograph I had seen in the paper. It was a man making a calculation he did not relish. "Do you want to stay here?" he asked. He had never asked the question of me with such simplicity before. I thought of peonies and potting soil, and the ergonomic way my hands knew each stem. I thought of the ultrasound scraps, of the photograph in my wallet, of the way my life had been bent by a single night. I thought of Sophie and Marie and Gabriella and the tenuous beginning of a family I did not know how to hold yet. "I want my life," I said finally. "All of it. Not just the safe parts, not just the parts you like." He nodded like someone taking instructions from a gardener. "Then stay," he said. "But we will make a plan. Not to take from you, but to keep you." I had to trust the shape of his promise without being able to own the mechanics of it. Trust is not a single candle lit in a dark room. It is a set of small matches, struck again and again, until you have enough light to walk by. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the dusty glass and made a stripe across my counter, I packed a box of things from my back room into a battered tote. Favorite scissors, a tin of staples, a scratched photograph of my mother standing in front of a garden I'd inherited. I closed the shop for a short while to replant a window box and then left a sign that read, in my handwriting, "Back shortly." I didn't call it anything more militant than that. I didn't want to make a spectacle of leaving. I wanted to do it like pruning a plant, with purpose and without drama. Gabriella drove me in a low, confident car with children's drawings on the rearview mirror. She held my hand in hers in that way sisters do when an unspoken pact has been made. Nico followed in a car with driver, and I watched the rear view as the outline of bloom and thorn receded. My pots, my sign with the paint starting to peel, the lamppost where Sophie used to inform me of gossip. I felt the car move like a small vessel crossing a harbor. We arrived at the Valente estate through a gate that closed with a deliberateness that sounded like a verdict. The house swallowed up the rain and exhaled a sound that was almost a promise. I set my bag down on a table in a room that still smelled faintly of lemon oil and decided, in that moment, that there would be other mornings. I would not be erased. I would have my hands in the soil again. I would make plans. Outside, in the courtyard, men in neutral suits stood like sentries, and beyond them, in the glimmer of distance, someone was already speaking in a tone that suggested negotiation was beginning. I could feel the machinery of a family rearranging itself around the smallest, most stubborn human thing, a life that had not yet been born. The box of my things sat on the floor like a small fortification. I opened it, took out the photograph I had placed in my wallet earlier, and held it between my fingers. The grain was coarse, the image coy. I set it on the mantel as if I were giving my future a place to rest for the moment. There was a knock at the door. Nico stood in the doorway with his jacket over one arm, the kind of expression that precedes an apology or a battle. He did not look like a man who had decided everything for me. He looked like a man who understood the scale of what he had claimed and was learning, with a surprising humility, how to be present without owning. "We will not make decisions for you," he said, simply, as if the sentence could be a shield and a scaffold. In that moment, I felt a resolve settle in me like a well-made bouquet. I had not chosen the uproar that came with a name like Valente. I had not consented to headlines, but I had chosen to keep what was mine. My voice, my shop, the terms on which I would let someone into my life. The rain beat on the windows like applause or warning. I couldn't tell which. The evening would be long. The world outside was already bargaining with itself. Inside, I folded my hands and listened to the sound of someone learning how to be careful. The rest, I thought, would be work. The months that followed felt like the slow, patient work of propagation seed, tending, waiting for something stubborn to root. There were days that were all light and small miracles. A quiet afternoon arranging ranunculus at the counter. The feel of soil between my fingers as I repotted a lemon tree on the back porch of the guest Matteo as an idea that expanded enough to take up space in my head and in conversations. There were other days that rearranged everything in a single bruise. A note moved from a messenger app into a real envelope. A shadow when the shop's back door was left ajar. A headline that tried to frame my choices as spectacle instead of consequence. Dr. Morrison became a voice I trusted the way you trust a weather report, partly for the facts, mostly for the calm. He never dramatized the scans. He simply told me what was happening inside me like someone reading a map. "Strong heartbeat," he said once, with that gentle gravity that made me imagine a drummer somewhere, steadying the pace. "Growth is on track. Keep monitoring, and call if anything feels off." Those early months were full of small adjustments, managing nausea with ginger candies and stale crackers, taking long walks when the heat allowed and talking to the rounded space beneath my shirt like it was a stubborn roommate. I was falling in love with. I kept a journal, a thing I hadn't done since I left college. That began with practical notes and slid toward the lyrical. He likes rosemary. I like that he likes rosemary. I wrote down dreams and the names that felt like weather. Matteo was the one that seemed to fit the syllables of this life, best Italian consonants that felt both delicate and firm. Like a stem you could rely on to stand upright. Living in the Valenti guest house was an odd, necessary, liminal space. It was not a cage. Antonio made sure of that. It was a place where the perimeter was managed in a way I did not have the bandwidth to organize and where my hands were not idle. Nico made a point of showing up at the edges of my days, rather than at the center. He learned to be a presence you could rely on without elbowing the space I needed to breathe. He learned to leave me to my routines, to the rhythms that shaped my sense of self, and to offer help only when asked. But presence and power exist in different proportions, and there were moments when the two collided. Once, He arranged for an entire delivery of soil to be sent to Bloom and Thorn so the shop could survive the season, and I found myself standing at the receiving bay with a stack of invoices and a man who had assumed financial solutions were the only solutions that mattered. He apologized when I met him at the door and told him, plainly, that help was welcome but not permission to take over. I want to support you, he said. Not replace. There was a steadiness to his words that made me think of anchors. There was also a stubbornness in him that came from a lifetime of being told the world bent when the Valente name moved. He was learning to let things bend around other people's choices, not bend them into his plans. Learning parenthood with Nico at my side was a study in small correctives. He was impatient by nature, used to decisions being fast and final, but he discovered an almost meticulous patience with Mateo that had nothing to do with family power and everything to do with the way a sleeping infant softened the angles of a man who had been raised to inhabit them. He sat in the rocker for midnight feeds, like a man attending to a delicate instrument, fumbled with burp clods the way someone unaccustomed to tenderness fumbles with new tools, and asked the kinds of questions that were less about competence and more about wanting to do well. "How tight is the swaddle?" he would ask, watching my hands fold the blanket. "Not too tight." He would mimic me and then laugh at his own awkwardness, a laugh that started at his throat and ended in his hands. He bought books, small, practical volumes on infant care, and would bring them to me with a seriousness that made me want to keep teaching him. We had pre-birth classes in the hospital's small teaching room. The other couples in our class were not like us. Some were nervous, some were chatty, all were earnest. Nico sat with his arms folded, absorbing terminology and breathing techniques the way one might take in a foreign language. At one point, the instructor asked partners to practice soothing an infant with simple shushing and patting techniques. Nico's first attempt was clumsy. His hand was too firm. His voice was unexpectedly high. The instructor corrected him with a smile that acknowledged his sincerity more than his skill. He tried again. This time the rhythm found its cadence. The way he looked when it worked, relieved, proud, and quietly delighted, was not the expression of someone victorious. It was the face of someone starting to belong to the small rituals of another life. Not every lesson came in classes. Some of them arrived as conversations at midnight when my sleep was shallow and the future seemed like an unfinished room. "I don't want you to disappear," I told him once, a confession folded into my whisper. "I won't let your world swallow mine." "You won't have to," he said. "I promise. I don't want to retain things. I want to share them." He said it with a kind of sincerity that made me feel the word share for the first time as a viable structure for power. He meant it. He tried to build the scaffolding for a life that could hold both layers without one erasing the other. Threats did not cease. The Russo presence lingered like a small bruise you are reminded of when the weather changes. We had more notes, anonymous texts that implied inconvenience could be escalated. A cracked tire outside the guest house that could have been random but wasn't. There was a sense that we were being measured and that the ledger of favors and grievances was being consulted in rooms I would never enter. Nico's response was measured and domestic in the things that mattered. He fortified in ways that suited the life I wanted. Better locks on the back door, a driver who was circumspect rather than showy, the occasional discreet presence of security that made stores close to the Valente estate look at our driveway with less curiosity. Antonio negotiated quietly, offering businesses that had nothing to do with violence as a form of currency and partnerships that shifted loyalty by aligning values rather than by intimidation. There was, too, a pivotal moment when diplomacy was chosen over display. A messenger from the Russo family arrived, more emissary than threatened, requested a meeting. Antonio did not call men in masks. He did what he had always done. He took a room, a table, and a set of terms. We sat across from them with lawyers present and with a Staten look that said we meant to trade consequences for a different ledger. The exchange was less about giving in and more about reassigning the costs and making clear that the price for noise would be financial and reputational rather than bodily. Words were used like pruning shears, precise, efficient. There was no show of force that read like triumph, only the weight of pragmatic compromise. I watched Nico in that room and saw him be the heir in a way that had nothing to do with bluster. He negotiated for safety in ways that preserved mine and delivered on them in ways that did not involve flaring. That day, I realized the most important part of his transformation wasn't that he could command a room. It was that he could choose restraints when it mattered more than muscle. He learned, in negotiation, to buy peace rather than demand it. And in doing so, he started to bend his family's resources away from old habits and toward stability. The birth changed everything. The cliché is true in the specifics. Nothing prepares you, and yet everything prepares you. The labor was long and precise and real. I had always imagined it in fragments. A contraction here, a breath there, a small human appearing like the final petal of a bud. It arrived with the overwhelming, calm urgency that makes fear and courage collude into a single act. Nico never left my side. He held my hand and learned the map of my breath, as if the cartography of my body were the most important document he had ever been given. Matteo's first cry was not cinematic. It was a small, fierce announcement that a life had elected to begin. Antonio stood in the doorway with a face that had folded into something like wonder. Gabriella pressed my hand like a benediction. Dr. Morrison announced his weight and measurements with the kind of professional tenderness that marked him as more than a doctor. He was a witness. Brought back to the guest house, the first days with Matteo felt both new and absurdly familiar. There were feeds in the dim light, burps and lullabies, sofa naps that lasted 15 minutes and felt like a lifetime. There were questions about vaccinations and pediatricians and the names of baby cereals. And there were the ridiculous triumphs of changing a diaper without disaster. Matteo shaped us as much as we shaped him. He was a small, uncompromising presence whose needs reframed our calendars and priorities. Parenthood has a peculiar leveling quality. It is a place where power diffuses into routine. Nico learned to change diapers with a competence that made me laugh aloud. He learned to make a bottle without checking his watch, to warm it to the temperature I preferred, and to hold Matteo in that way where his face would soften and his speechlessness become a language of its own. He brought Luca over sometimes, and the boys one toddler, one notch traced, around the shop like two suns circling each other. Gabriella's presence was a balm. She taught me to let others help, to accept the delicious care of family without guilt. Antonio's stance softened, not overnight, but with the slow, steady erosion of repeated witnessing. He came to watch Matteo at play and held him in the way a man who had not allowed himself small indulgences now allowed. With a mixture of curiosity and an almost shy affection. His pride in his son, the man who had defied arranged expectation to claim a child, was complicated but real. He began to see my insistence on agency as less a provocation and more a necessary element of the family's future stability. He would not admit it in words. Instead, he did the thing that mattered. He advocated for things that would help all of us thrive. He invested in businesses that could pivot into legitimate enterprises, hired new managers who would steer the family holdings with less reliance on muscle, and set up meetings that were focused on modernization rather than revenge. There were quieter, more tender reckonings. Once, on a Sunday that smelled of basil and warm bread, Antonio invited me to sit with him in his study. He asked me to tell him about bloom and thorn, about suppliers, about soil, about the small economies of a retail life. I expected condescension. Instead, he listened. He asked questions with the curious attention of someone learning a new craft. When I left, he had offered to finance a small renovation that would help the shop expand its workshop, a pragmatic gift with no press attached. It read, more than words ever could, as acceptance. The Russo pressure eased in proportion to the cost-benefit calculations made by men who preferred profit to bloodshed. It did not disappear because men like them sometimes choose different ledgers for their gains. It ceased to be our daily punctuation. Instead, the new threats, those of the banal variety, stayed. Sleepless nights, the fear of an errant car outside the guest house, the knowledge that our choices had consequences in forms both expected and unexpected. The thing about becoming a family is that the world keeps bringing you ordinary challenges and extraordinary ones in equal measure. There were times when a burst pipe filled the nursery with water, and we laughed until our sides hurt, hands clasped under the leak as if it were a new kind of baptism. There were nights when Mateo's fever spiked and the franticness returned, and Nico became a kind of sentinel, pacing the floor until the slow climb back to health happened like a miracle we could measure. Years, more than months, are what it took for the second stage of our story. Mateo became a toddler who hoarded rocks and kissed the gnome in the garden fiercely. He learned how to say Nico with the clipped consonant his father cherished, and mama like a lilt that made me rearrange my whole day around his happiness. We became a family, in the pragmatic sense, filed as next of kin, protected by legal counsel, known as the parents of Mateo in the register of a city that once knew me as only the woman with the flower shop. We also became a family in the way that matters more, the one born of routine and presence and the quiet resurrections of trust. Nico's impulsive announcements became rare. He learned the value of asking me the small things. What time to schedule Mateo's checkup, how to invite Gabriella for dinner without it being a Valente family event, what kind of cake Mateo preferred. For his second birthday, chocolate frosting on the side. He never stopped being protective. But the protection shifted into partnership safety measures installed after conversations we had both consented to, boundaries observed without me having to demand them twice. When we discovered we were expecting again 2 little lines on a greenish test that we held together in the kitchen like contraband, news it felt like the world was giving us another chance to practice our citizenship and family. Twins, the doctor told us with a soft smile, and my knees nearly gave out. The surprise of it felt almost like a joke the universe told, and then waited patiently while we laughed and cried in equal measure. Pregnancy with twins brought its own landscape. It was busier, heavier. I visited Dr. Morrison more often. There were ultrasounds where 2 heartbeats flickered like the wings of birds trying to gather for lift. Nico became more meticulous. He packed snacks for the appointments, brought a thermos of tea, and would hold my hand during the scans with a careful intensity that made the room feel small and holy. Gabriella started knitting small hats in neutral colors, and Luca contributed an alarming number of mismatched socks he declared perfect for baby feet. Expectations tightened. The Russo family flared a final time in a way that could have been costly but was, by then, handled with a maturity that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with bargaining for peace. Antonio sat with the other families and brokered a pact that involved business concessions, shared investments, and a public, ceremonial gesture of truce. It was less dramatic than any movie would have shown. There were speeches, handshakes, and a private meeting afterward where men exchanged the kind of words that read like contracts, commitments to refrain, to invest, to move capital into legitimate channels that made violence more costly than it was worth. It wasn't perfect. There were resentments that lingered like old stains. There were acquaintances who resented our softness and who pined for old certainties. But overall, the balance shifted. Antonio understood, finally, that his son's priorities had changed, and that the world the Valente family wanted to inherit had less room for the brutalities of the past. The twins Sophia and Elena arrived on a rain-scented morning much like the one that had brought Nico into my shop. The labor was a double intensity of the earlier one, and it left me exhausted and elated in equal measure. Their cries came in succession, a duet that sounded like the promise of 2 small lives that would complicate and sweeten everything we had arranged. Gabriella and Luca were in the waiting room. Sophie and Marie arrived with the kind of practical gifts that feel like declarations of solidarity. A mountain of diapers, a pot of something to it that smelled like home. When the babies were skin warm and small against my chest, Nico sat back, as if taking in a new landscape. His expression was one of someone who had been given a secret map and was learning how to read it. 2, he said, as if the numeral itself deserved reverence. He kissed my forehead, then both their tiny heads, and added, with his habitual frankness, I'm terrified and ready. Parenting with 2 other small bodies altered the architecture of daylight. There were feeds and naps, sibling rivalries that began before the language was fully formed, and a chorus of midnight cries that became a family choir. Mateo adapted in the way of children who must either rally or rebel. He quickly adopted the role of a proud older brother who taught Sophia how to knock over towers and instructed Elena on the imperious proper use of a toy truck. The house hummed with the noise of being lived in fully. Amid these domestic passages, a significant deliberate moment emerged. Our wedding. It was neither a capitulation to expectation nor an acceptance of a world that had sought to own us. It was a choice we made together, quietly and with intention. We decided on a small ceremony, held in the back courtyard of Bloom and Thorn on a late spring afternoon when the peonies were at their most ridiculous and the air smelled like sugar and rain. The guest list was modest. Family, close friends, Gabriella, with Luca at her side, Sophie and Marie, and the handful of staff who had become our chosen family. Antonio walked me down a makeshift aisle that smelled like cedar and eucalyptus. It was a gesture that had weight because it was chosen. Not an arrangement signed under duress, but a hand extended in a way that meant, finally, acceptance. He did not make a speech of grand pronouncements. Instead, he folded his hand over mine and said, in the low voice I had come to recognize when he was most sincere, "You make my son better than I expected." We kept it simple. We exchanged words. We had written ourselves no grand vows screamed into a microphone, only the particular, ordinary promises we felt we could keep. Nico did not take my last name without thought. We discussed things like taxes and passports and the practicalities of a blended life with a clarity that felt like foreplay to partnership. At one point, as the sun angled through a lattice and touched the sprigs of baby's breath we used in the bouquets, Gabriella leaned over and whispered, "You cleaned him up nicely," and Nico made a face that suggested he had indeed practiced. I wore the pendant Nico had commissioned earlier that year. A small circle of resin in which a tiny fragment one of the jagged corners of that ripped ultrasound was embedded. He had found a jeweler who specialized in delicate restorations and asked them to preserve the piece with care. The pendant was not it was a statement. The fragment glinted like an apology and a promise fused into something wearable. When he slid it into the hollow of my throat, I felt the entire arc of our story hang there with me choices made, battles reframed, tenderness earned. He did not make a spectacle of the gesture, he simply said, "So the pieces are with you. Always." We danced in the courtyard to music that was more about rhythm than perfection. Matteo attempted to copy my steps and ended up doing something inventively nonsensical that made everyone laugh. Sophia and Elena fell asleep in a borrowed blanket, their fingers curled like flowers. The Valenti name was present but not oppressive. It was a day of softness where power wore civility like a well-fitting coat. There were, inevitably, conversations that had to be had about the future. Succession planning in a family like the Valentis is a long conversation with many stakeholders. I insisted, stubbornly and often, that any change in the family's direction be accompanied by accountability. Nico agreed to a structure that would introduce more legitimate oversight into the family businesses, including boards and independent audits, a diagnosis that read like a rebuke to the old ways, but felt necessary for the kind of life I wanted us to live. Antonio grumbled but acquiesced, the way someone might let a fence be moved because the garden would look better. Time, more than anything else, was the alchemy that made the story feel normal. It took years for the Valente holdings to pivot, for investments to return dividends that were not stained by the old methods. It took years for acquaintances to accept that a woman with dirt under her nails could be the co-architect of a family's future rather than a liability to be managed. It took patience, measured acts, and a stubborn adherence to ordinary routines that were the bedrock of trust. We kept the pieces of the original ultrasound in more than one place. One fragment, the smallest jagged edge that had been missed in the initial reassembly, sat at the bottom of a glass paperweight on my shop counter, the piece I had brushed away like a petal that I hadn't meant to ruin. Another fragment was set in the pendant I wore. A third was sealed beneath a clear resin in a small keepsake box that Matteo liked to pull out when he wanted to see when Mama was waiting for us. The fragments were not a shrine to drama. They were, for me, an honest totem of the choice I had made of agency and of the strange ways life rearranges itself when we let it. There were mornings when I would sit at the kitchen table with Nico across from me, 3 cups of coffee between us and flour, dusting the counter because Matteo had insisted on helping make pancakes. The children would be embroiled in some grand argument about whose turn it was to use a toy, their voices high and small and immediate. The house hummed with the kind of chaos that is both exhausting and intoxicating. Nico had changed in ways both big and microscopic. He still retained the soft edges of the man who can read a room and decide what must be done, but he had learned to ask for consent often, and to share power in more than performative ways. He arrived at board meetings with notes that emphasized long-term community investment as much as profit. He visited the shop not as a patron but as a partner, bringing new ideas for a pop-up that would showcase Blumenthorn's arrangements in a downtown gallery and paying attention to which suppliers paid their workers fairly. He still had the old grudges. The world doesn't let you completely shed what raised you, but the balance had shifted. One evening, years after that first tear, I sat at the shop long after we had closed. The light was soft and the air smelled of damp earth and roses. Matteo had a scraped knee from the afternoon's adventures, and Sophia and Elena were asleep at home. I took the small keepsake box from the back room and opened it. Even though I had looked at those fragments 100 times before, the tiny pieces of paper lay there like islands, edges white against darker centers, grainy images that once had threatened to determine a life. I held one precisely between finger and thumb and remembered the exact sound of the tear, the way it had felt, like the closing of a particular kind of door and the opening of many others. There were no dramatics left in me about it, only the clear knowledge that the choice had been mine. Nico had claimed the child in public, and that claim had been a catalyst. It had forced Uzmi, him, and the entire Valenti apparatus into negotiation and into the slow labor of becoming a family. Sometimes people ask me if I regret tearing it. Most days I answer with the practical honesty of someone who runs a shop. No. It was my boundary. Occasionally, in the small hours when memory feels like an ache, I answer differently. Then I say, I tore it because I could not bear the thought of being spoken for. Then I add, because I want the truth to land precise. And look what came of the mess. Matteo will be 7 next month. He draws pictures of our shop with a sincere hand, using too much purple and stickers where stickers are not necessary. Sophia and Elena are 5 and 3, respectively, and fight within seconds about everything they can imagine. Nico and I are not perfect. We have arguments about the division of labor, small, combustible things like who takes the garbage out and who handles the school's picky emails. We consult our calendars like diplomats. We forgive and apologize. That simple economy of marriage that is not flashy but functional. Antonio sits sometimes with a cup of espresso in the corner by my office, reading a financial paper and commenting on yield curves like it's nothing. He brings Luca over on Sundays and sneaks an extra cookie to the children under my roomy glare. He has come to love our chaotic breakfast table in his own careful way. Gabriella is an anchor in the way siblings often are, both a conspirator and a conscience. Once, on a rainy afternoon like the one that summoned Nico into my shop years ago, I found myself laughing with him over a spilled pot of He reached for my hand as if we were making a small treaty. You kept the shop, he said. You kept your life. I kept both, I corrected, smiling. You kept the rest. He looked at me then with a softness that had nothing to do with power displays. We kept it, he said. All of it. We had kept it because we refused to let legacy and label determine the shape of our days. We had kept it because I insisted on terms that preserved my voice and my livelihood, and because he learned that protecting someone did not mean possessing them. We had shelved old methods like tools that had become rusty and dangerous. In the end, the ultrasound fragments were not evidence of a claim, but of a choice. They weren't proof of ownership. They were proof of starting. Nico had claimed the child publicly in a way that altered the trajectory of everyone involved, but that claim was only the beginning. What made our family was not the statement the media had once blared across screens. It was the accumulation of ordinary acts. Making coffee at 2 a.m., balancing invoices, pleading with a toddler to wear shoes, consoling a frightened child after a nightmare, sitting in a boardroom and insisting on shunning violent profit. Sometimes, when business talks and family life press in at once, I go down to the shop early, before anyone else wakes. The lamps are on, the counters waxy with the residue of the previous day's work. I take down the paperweight that houses that smallest fragment of the ultrasound and set it in the light. It looks like a small, stubborn bit of story held in glass. I press my thumb to the resin and feel, stupidly, like a person who has survived a storm and loves the way the air smells afterward. The city still has its shadows. There are names and histories that do not dissolve simply because we change the tone of our ledgers. But when I look at my life, at Matea's sticky hands, at Sophia's fierce hugs, at Elena's stubborn insistence on dressing herself in a manner that would make the fashion world gasp, I know that the thing that began with a torn piece of paper has become something steadier. I once thought power was the roar of a man in a suit. I have come to understand power as the ability to choose again and again, to sit at a table and pick a different dish, to build businesses that employ kindly people, to teach my children to say please and sorry and to mean them. I have learned that love is, more often than not, a set of repeated, humble actions rather than any grand moment. If this family's story moved you, subscribe for more stories about imperfect choices and the small, fierce ways people build new lives. And if you ever find yourself in Blumenthorn on a rainy afternoon, ask for a cup of tea. I'll show you where we keep the paperweight and how we tell the story of how something began by tearing, by claiming, and by choosing to stay.